Your second time at JLF, but it seems like your dressing style has changed a bit since the time I saw you 6 years ago.
Uh, I've been infected by the JLS style, I guess.
Uh-huh. Well, we are here today to partly to celebrate the release of your new book, which came out only 5 or 6 days ago, The Freedom Artist. And I've always been curious to ask people who've written a lot of books, is the feeling still the same of excitement and pleasure? As can you take us back to the time when in the late 70s you got your first letter from a publisher saying they were going to bring your book out, and how have things changed since then?
Well, it's a very strange feeling as a writer. You write novels and stories, and you write, and you send them out to publishers, and sometimes you never hear from them. I was in Nigeria then when I wrote my first novel. I was about 16, 17. A very unwise age to think of writing your first novel. And I began to feel that publishers were a myth. Because I sent the books out and I didn't hear from them, so I thought they were an invention of the public. Before you've had a book of yours published, you always get the feeling that people who've had books published are dead. Because I had never met a living writer at the time. And so after about 7 drafts of my first novel, The Flowers and Shadows, I was very surprised one morning in London to get this letter on very thin paper saying that Ben Okri wish to inform you with great pleasure that your novel, Flowers and Shadows, has been accepted by us to be published in due course. That's virtually the letter. I remember it off by heart. And I remember being so stunned by this. It was a kind of like a changing moment in my life. It's a moment I haven't really lost. And I remember for about 6 days afterwards, I was practically levitating. Then I went to the publisher's offices to talk about editing and publication. Quite extraordinary. My first editor was in love with J.R. Tolkien and was trying to encourage me to become an African Tolkien, which was a very bizarre idea because you don't quite get elves and trolls in Nigeria. But I've never lost the feeling. In fact, if I'm honest with you, with every new book I publish, I feel more vulnerable and more excited at the same time.
From that moment at the start to your winning the Booker Prize for the Famished Road, there's 10 or 12 years in that. Do you feel with that book that it was you who found the best possible expression for your voice, or was it at that point that the world discovered what you were onto?
Oh, I think a writer is always trying to find the best possible expression. There isn't an optimum moment of expression really in a writer's life. But there was something about the Famished Road. There was something about that moment in the world at that time. There was kind of a conjunction, a meeting of a lining of the stars on earth and in heaven, literary heaven, as it were. But to go back to the business of finding one's voice, I don't think it's possible to write a novel like The Famished Road without having found your voice already. And I would say I found my voice in my third book, my first book of short stories called Incidents at the Shrine. I always tell people that the short story, for prose, the short story is the medium in which to really learn the craft and the art of writing. With the novel, you learn the arc and maybe the art. But craft, which has to do with making, intensity of shaping, that's the short story. The short story is a jeweler's art. It's an art of miniaturists, people who make worlds in tiny little things. You can only do it with voice, with the right voice.
I'm going to read the opening few sentences of your book.
Please, I wouldn't dare do it right now.
It is written in the oldest legends that all are born in prison. This prison is all they know. Literature describes life in it. Religion hints at redemption from it. Having lived here all their lives, humans have ceased to see it as a prison. It's only 100 words or less, but if one were to do a literary blind test to a lot of readers of fiction and say, whose work might this be? I'm sure a lot of them would immediately say Ben Okri. And I don't think it's so much a function of your theme as it is also a function of your style and that voice that you have. And in a way, your books always have this attitude of of attacking the very nature of reality itself. They're not just about people in the world, they're about what the world itself means.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because the whole of fiction, the whole of literature, actually emerges from the questions that human beings ask about reality. It's only because we ask questions about reality that we can ask questions about society.
Yes.
It's only because we ask questions about reality that we can ask questions about culture, about justice, about what we're doing to one another, about who we can be, who we fail to be. For me, the central question of reality, of literature, is the question of reality. Because once we have a good relationship with that understanding, then we are poised to make the world as we can make it, because we understand how worlds are made. And that's what literature does. Literature gives us the psychic understanding of the building blocks of reality itself.
But literature is very closely connected to the idea of the richness and the descriptive power of language itself. But there are some disturbing visions early on in this book of an imagined world where books have drifted away and people are connected up to gadgets. Do you think humanity could be diminished like that in the future, that we lose our linguistic powers, as they seem to do here for a while?
I think we're in danger of doing that every day. I think one of the most... I said earlier that reality is the foundation of literature, but what makes that foundation work is language itself. Language is how we mediate reality. But the job of keeping language alive, the job of making language not only functional, but powerful in the work it does for us as human beings, is one of the greatest tasks that a civilization embarks on. And I feel right now that we're losing language. We're losing language for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons being the attack on the nature of truth that we're sustained to at this present time in the world. Because you don't need me to tell you that we're living in a time where the nature of truth is under tremendous attack. And it's been done through language. And when we diminish the meaning of words like freedom, truth, integrity, diminish the meaning of words like immigration, diminish the meaning of words like race, diminish the meaning of words like the other, the stranger, Indian, African, we begin to diminish ourselves. And we make it possible for hatred and tyranny to happen in the world. Thank you.
But how, in your view, does one fight that degradation when the decay comes out from all sides? Because you can only fight the degradation of language with language itself, or is there another source?
I think maybe one of the most powerful ways of fighting that degradation is through language, but it is through the language of the imagination. Because the degradation starts when, first of all, politicians who are the master wielders of the public face of language. The writer is the master wielder of the private face of language. We read writers in private, but we're influenced. We're inflamed by the public language of politicians, by the demonizing language of politicians. When they speak to us in great crowds, that's the public face of language. And that public face makes it important for the qualities of imagination to be diminished. I was given an interview yesterday, and the interviewer said to me, you don't really believe that places retain the feelings of people who have lived there before. And I said, absolutely, because everything is impinged on by our presence here. The same is what happens with imagination. And so the imaginative use of language, metaphor, simile, the symbolic language, is actually what rescues language from decay. That and precision. There are two kinds of languages in literature. There's a language of precision, the language of realism, and then there's a language of dream, of poetry.
Yes.
Poetry keeps language functional at its highest level, at its most imaginative level, at the level of possibilities. Precision and realism keeps language functional at the level of things. When you emphasize one over the other, you create different kinds of worlds. And I'm saying that the poetic must be kept alive, and the precise must be kept clean and functional. We need a balance of both. That's why this book is about two kinds of narratives, the narrative of truth and the narrative of imagination.
But just listening to what you're saying, it could be said that there is something common between storytellers and politicians in that, between writers and politicians, in that they're both storytellers, and in a way, both are liars. We can't persuade ourselves that we are always votaries of the truth, can we?
Yeah, both are liars, but both use their lies to accomplish different things. The politician uses the lies of language to persuade us into one kind of action or another in the direction of the power they're trying to drain from us. Because that is what the function of politics finally is the draining of power from the people to them, and then the wielding of that power on behalf of people. That's what power is. But the writer isn't trying to drain power from the people. The writer is actually trying to restore power to the people. The power of their individual freedom, the power of people's capacity to dream their world, the power of people to seize the full rights of their citizenship. The artist is an empowerer of humanity. The politician at the highest level is an empowerer of humanity as well. So there are politicians who are artists. I would say Gandhi, Mandela, even Obama are politicians as artists. But then there are also artists as politicians. But that's a different story.
One of the themes of your stories is the power of storytelling itself. They are figures inside the story who talk about the world of story. They aren't just people who represent story. And I noticed that you have that little book of yours, which is very beautiful, called Thoughts on Storytelling. And I do think this could be a good moment for you to read whatever you like from that.
Yes, I'd like to read a few things. But before I do, I want to just say very briefly about the Freedom Artist.
Yes.
Which has got probably one of the most unusual covers of any of my books. Can you see it? Because unlike any other of my books, it actually has at the top part of it the central question that I ask in the book, who is the prisoner? And this novel is a novel primarily about freedom. And storytelling is primarily about the freedom of the imagination. So I'm going to read some notes to a modern storyteller from my little book, The Mystery Feast. The most sensational stories are not necessarily the ones that endure. The stories that last are the ones most cunningly, most mysteriously told. The greatness of a story is more in the telling than in the tale. Our age is lost in sensational stories. Without mystery, the mystery of art, a story will not linger in the imagination. A fragment is more fascinating than the whole. Direct things bore us. Indirect things awaken us. The way a story is told affects the reality of the story. This is a tricky one. We incubate stories like maggots in rotten meat. We incubate stories like spores.
Do you feel you always knew that, or that you came to an awareness of these things from writing your own stories?
I came to an awareness of these things from watching the stories of life and from reading. I mean, people ask me often, how do you actually learn about the mystery of stories and the way it affects our lives? Well, there's only three ways we learn. We learn by living and making mistakes and suffering the consequences of those mistakes. We learn by reading. And reading prepares us as well as refines us and helps us contextualize our lives in a very strange way. Sometimes you read something in a book that you will not experience for 40 years. And then when you come to experience it, it's almost like a deja vu, because you've been prepared for it by some book that you read that you've now forgotten. And the third way you learn is through those secret questions that the self asks itself. They're not the questions that the brain asks itself, but the questions that the self asks itself. It's that self-asking self-questions that stories, that literature, that art feeds.
And if we are to emphasize that, then clearly in this history of literature, the novel has a very important place, because for the first time in this very long tradition, you get to a point where the individual self and what it goes through in the world looks at itself in the mirror and tries to find precise language for itself, isn't it?
You're talking about the history of the novel?
Yes.
Yes. I think the novel itself was one of the most important moments in the evolution of human consciousness. People will talk about the invention of the wheel, the discovery of fire. I will say the first story that was told, whether it was told in dance, in gesture, in art, on a cave wall, because they're all stories, finally, or through grunts and sounds, and then finally through language, that was another, I think, the third great moment in the awakening of the human spirit. But the novel is the moment when consciousness becomes ripe enough to read its own story in abstract form, in the mirror of words. And I think the novel and civilization go hand in hand in a way. Because it's impossible to write a novel without the complete surround of a world that sustains it. Of structures of belief, of structures of a world that's been made and built and shaped by human hands.
Before the novel, where can we look to in literature for places where the shape of human thought is recorded? The way, not just what human being, the content of it, but the way thought itself works. Or is this what the novel brings into being? It's a kind of recorder of how thought unfolds.
Well, before the novel, we had fables.
Yes.
Before the novel, we had poetry. We had those epic poems, which I think of as early novels. And before those, I think we just had the great tradition of oral storytelling. But the thing about oral storytelling is that it is stories that we hear that impact on us through the ears and then through the imagination. It's a different development of consciousness from stories that you read with the eyes and then process with the brain. They're two different tracks. And I don't think that the novel has superseded the oral storytelling tradition because they develop side by side and they appeal to different parts of the human spirit.
You might in some way say the novel is itself a homage to the oral storytelling tradition because it involves characters within the book also trying to convince each other with stories, isn't it?
And the novel is about voices. Yeah.
I noticed that before the book begins, there is a page with a small instruction, read slowly. Why is that?
You mean, why does it have a small instruction?
Why have you put it in this book of all books?
Well, I had it in my last novel, but it was a big instruction in the Age of Magic, and I think because it was a big instruction, people didn't see it. So I made the instruction smaller, and you noticed it.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
There is a figure in this book.
But the reason why it's there is because I want people to read I want people to read this book slowly. For some time now, I've felt that people read too fast. I think we do too many things too fast. I think we talk too fast, we listen too fast, we think too fast. It's made to be a great credit to read fast, but I think we miss 80% of the magic of what we're reading when we read fast. We miss the layers, the pauses, the poetry, the secret instructions in the style of the writer. When we read too fast, we impose our instruction on the secret instructions of the text. But when we read slow, it's like entering into someone else's dream. So reading slowly magnifies what you're reading.
I took it as a kind of instruction that your work has a very distilled manner about it, and it's not something that one can lightly rush over. But I was thinking that this mode of prose in this book is different from some others in other books of yours. So in a way, you kind of have a kind of bouquet of different narrative modes. I'm thinking in particular of a novel you wrote in the mid-90s called Dangerous Love.
Yes.
That's far more like a realist novel
Yes.
than books in this mode of yours. And do you think that's the sort of book you could not write anymore or that you have left behind? Because that had its own pleasures as well.
I think every novel that a writer writes is about specific questions that the writer is asking the world and themselves at that particular time. And right now, for me, the big question of the world and of the self, of the individual, the big question is the question of freedom. And I don't mean just political freedom. I mean the freedom to think to its greatest conclusion one's own thoughts. The freedom to ask the questions that we're not encouraged to ask. The freedom to see if maybe this world that we're living in, that we're told is real, the freedom to examine the layers of its reality and its unreality. The freedom of one's spiritual beliefs. I mean, you would not believe how in certain countries right now it is difficult to have a spiritual belief. Just as in some countries it's difficult not to have a spiritual belief. They're all freedoms. And for me, the question of freedom needs a special kind of narrative. It needs a narrative of quest. It needs a narrative of a quest for truth, the greatest quest for truth. So I can still write the novel of realism. It's just that I don't find it as interesting as the novel of deep questions.
Since you say the book is about the place of freedom and the attack on freedom in the world today, could I put it to you that one of the problems with the idea of freedom, with the attack on freedom in the world today, is partly the way some people imagine freedom itself as something very banal or kind of like a state of ease without responsibility?
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. People have a very strange idea about what freedom means. Freedom doesn't mean the freedom to burp in someone's face. Freedom does not mean, you know, the freedom to be rude to someone you don't know. Freedom doesn't mean the freedom to be inhospitable to strangers in your house. Freedom, for me, is the highest act of respect that human beings pay to one another. I would even go so far as to say that freedom really is the allowing of someone else's genius to flower so that my genius can flower. So for me, freedom is mutually empowering. But we think of freedom as, in its worst sense, as me separate from you. I'm going to do my own thing. I don't give a damn about you. Actually, freedom is hugely mutually respectful. And you never see freedom more clearly as in the quality of conversation that can be had between people. I love conversation. And you can tell true freedom between two people when there is this beautiful dance and flow in conversation. When conversation is one-sided, that's not conversation, and that's not freedom. So freedom is an extraordinary thing. Freedom is a thing of civilization. Is a thing of culture. Is a thing of intelligence. Is a thing of great responsibility. A thing of tact. A thing of sensibility.
Very beautiful. But does that mean that at some point, freedom meant individualism at a time when society's strictures were very difficult and very overpowering? But have we, as a sort of tragic conclusion of that logic, over-personalized the idea of what freedom means? So something that just means a state of personal ease?
Yes, but that's a lazy idea of freedom. I wouldn't call that freedom. I would call that laxity. Freedom as defined in political terms, freedom as defined in moral terms, freedom defined in spiritual terms. The spiritual definition of freedom is even more amazing than anything I've said so far. And maybe this is not the right place to talk about it. But the spiritual idea of freedom borders on the ultimate questions we ask ourselves about who we are as human beings. Because when we actually go on asking what it means to be human, it actually means asking about the ways in which our minds have been imprisoned by the ideas of the society in which we live. So that's a very, very difficult question.
And when we speak of the idea of expanding freedom, then we again return to the question of literature, isn't it? Because it is one of the few places in which we can imagine what it's like for a very long period of time within a work of literature, what it's like to be someone else.
Yes, that's what I love so much about literature, about the novel. Some people seem to think the novel is just about the beauty of language. But beauty of language is pretty worthless if it does not do the central thing that the novel does, which is plant into someone else's imagination an alternative reality, which is what a story is. By doing that, actually expand the imagination and therefore the humanity of the reader. It's only by reading, it's mainly by reading, that we know that someone else has an internal consciousness as rich, as contradictory, as troublesome, as wild, as untrammeled as we do. Because when we look at one another from the outside, all I can see is your external. I don't know that you've got an inner world. Even in our conversation might not reveal to me that you have an inner world. There are very few things that is actually able to give to somebody else the evidence of my inner consciousness, what makes me alive inside myself. And it's this thing that is actually the true dialogue between cultures, between individuals, between generations, and even between time. It's quite awe-inspiring to read a book written by someone 3,000 years ago, and to know that they suffer the same foolishness that we suffer today. It's quite amazing.
What has been the richest relationship of your life, and has it been with a book, a human being, or an idea?
Why did you phrase it in such a tripartite way?
Well, idea just came to me. The idea of the idea just came to me. I was saying
why can't a human being also be a book?
that would be a good answer, but you would have to expand on it.
Some of my favorite human beings are masterpieces, and some of my favorite books are human beings.
This is a good answer.
I remember when I read Don Quixote at the age of 23. It took me 6 months. I read it every day in the tube as I was going to work in the BBC, where I was a broadcaster at night. And it was the only time I could read it. And over that 6 months reading Don Quixote, I started out as a boy becoming a man. By the time I finished reading this book, I had become a man. And I'd become a man because I'd got to know a human being, a really mad, crazy human being called Don Quixote, and his great friend, Sancho. They are the great friends of my life. I go on having conversations with them to this very day. And why can't an idea also be a human being? So I was surprised by your distinction, because everything that is great that lives transcends the boundaries of its definition.
But I'd still like to take that question further. We were on this stage a few days ago discussing literary friendship, and actually this is something that is a very important idea to me. I feel that in the last decade, my most important relationships have been with other writers. And is there something, I know that it is a sort of a credo of yours that any human being can find a space of sharing with someone else. You just have to find the way. Yeah. But there are places where more intense relationships develop, isn't it? And in your case, who do you think you learned most about literature from?
It's not who, it's where for me. And I have the most intense relationships with people that I can have long walks with. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. I have a friend who said his great relationships comes with people he's had long drives with. That doesn't work for me, because you're talking to somebody who's trying to manipulate a steering wheel and fix a gear and is looking at the GPS and stuff like that. It's a four-way conversation. But when you go on a long walk with someone you like, and the walk has no destination, and there's no time involved in it. You're just walking. And actually, you're not walking anymore, because you're now in the conversation. The conversation is a walk, and the walk is a conversation. It's one of the most, it's one of the richest ways in which we break down barriers between ourselves and actually reveal the truth of our spirit. So for me, it's long walks with people. Can I read
Yes.
I want to read, since we talked about books, I want to read one little passage. Um, this is a section in the book that's about books. And it's one of the characters, her father, is a kind of curator of books in an age when books have disappeared. And I'm talking about her father's books. Another of her father's books was at the same time an oracle, the memory of a race, an obstacle course, a forest, a mirror, a television, a prophecy, a pyramid, and a village. Another book was at the same time a temple, a mountain, the planet Sirius, a hall of records, the bright city of Akhetaten, and a sacred province in Atlantis. Her father's books were not read in a normal way. Some of them were read with the hands. Some were read by placing them at the center of the forehead. One of the books could only be read with eyes closed. Another one could only be read in dreams while the reader was asleep with the book under the pillow. There was a very special book of her father's which could be read only by the dead. It was placed in their coffins over the heart. There was one book that was only read by drinking. Water was poured on its waterproof pages, and the water was drunk. The words filled out in the blood and heart and brains till the reader became the words. There was another special book that was read in the wind. The book was left dangling, the wind blew its pages, and the reader, with the light on their face, read the words which the winds dispersed. One of her father's favorite books was the one that was read only by writing it. But this book was such a great mystery that only initiates were allowed by participation to penetrate its pages.
Thank you so much, Ben. Very beautiful. And I remember the last time we did an event, there were about 100 people in the end who weren't able to ask questions, even after the ones who did. So today we're going to start a bit earlier. And
That's good.
who wants to ask? Let's begin with you. With you, and then we'll come to you after that.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, in the evolution of your understanding of the power of language, were there any pivotal sort of aha moments?
Aha. Yes, there were a few. Once I went back to Lagos because I live in London, and I've lived there for a while. I went back home to Lagos, and I went to a street near where my mother lives, and there was a dusty bookshop, the dustiest bookshop in the world, maybe the second dustiest bookshop after the bookshops along that street in Calcutta. It was one hell of a dusty bookshop, and there were very few books in there. There was one book, sun-bleached, on a stand. And I picked up this book, and it was called Labyrinths by Christopher Okigbo. And breathing in the dust of this bookshop, I began to read the opening lines of this great poem. Before you, Mother Edoto, naked I stand. Before your watery presence, a prodigal, leaning on an oil beam, lost in your legend. And I was a different person. Another moment was about a year after that, when someone gave me David Young's translation of Rilke's The Duino Elegies. And I opened that, red cover, first page. If you took me to your heart, If You Took Me to Your Heart is an address to an angel. 10 Elegies changed my life. Don Quixote. First time I read the Odyssey. Meeting Wole Soyinka when I was 24. Yeah. Reading Tagore about 15 years ago. First time I read Gitanjali. Changed me. Can anyone recite the beginning of Gitanjali?
Twinkle and Kanika.
Can you remember? I was hoping somebody would remind me of the beginning.
I can't.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. You mentioned about walking. Now, walking together with. Now, while reading books, have you ever read books while walking? Another related question is walking together and meditation. What you are really referring to is also meditating with books. And my final query is about freedom and desire. Since you refer to the spiritual dimension of freedom, and since life is also a dance with desire and its transcendence, so how do you relate freedom, desire, and transcendence, relating the spiritual and the everyday life together?
That's about 17 questions in one. I mean, you began with a perfectly manageable question like walking, and then you ended with a perfectly unmanageable question like freedom and desire and transcendence. What's wrong with you today?
I think that was its own panel. Perhaps you just start with the...
Can you read a book while walking? Yeah, I used to do that, and I used to walk into a lot of lampposts. But you know, better than reading a book while walking is to actually write a book while you're walking. That's the best kind of walking. And I do a lot of my writing walking, actually. There's some passages, it's a walking pace. Maybe when I was young, I wrote while I was running, and it was a kind of a running pace. Yeah. And desire, freedom, and transcendence. Whoa. Do you know one of the magical things about writing that people don't talk about is that writing at its highest, at its purest, in the act of it, I mean, not the quality of it, in the act of it, when you most disappear into what you're doing, is the closest that people come to meditation in this secular world. It's true. It's one of the few reasons why I'd recommend to people to write, because it's one of the few moments where people have this deep, intimate, silent relationship with the best part of themselves. Now, freedom, the dance of freedom and desire and transcendence, we need another panel for that, a smaller group of people so we can talk. We'll lock the doors and have a deep conversation about that, and then do some fine meditation together.
Somebody from the back? Yes, what about you?
Hi Ben, I have two questions for you. One, what has been your relationship between traveling and writing? How has traveling influenced your writing or not influenced your writing? And second question is, what is your process of writing? Do you go to secluded places? Do you rent out a hotel? Like, do you want to have a process? When you have a book in mind, do you have a certain process that you go through to complete that book? Or are you just normally in the society while you write it?
Thank you very much. Traveling is really wonderful for writing, because traveling breaks up the surface of your over familiarity with yourself and with the way your mind works. many writers who are going through writing difficulties, they travel and without knowing it, it's gone. They start to write again. I think traveling restores us to the freshness of self, especially when you go into a culture that's not your own. Suddenly everything is new. I mean, the trees are not written in a different language, but they may as well have been. You know, the sky feels different. The first time I went to Ethiopia, I could have sworn that the moon was upside down. That's a ridiculous thought, right? But it felt like that. So even the sky was inverted in some strange way. And then when you go back home, you're fresher. It's like the surface of the soil of your spirit has been turned, you know, like farmers advise us to. There are very few things that turn the surface of our spirit. Strange things that happen to us, suffering, love, travel. And how do I write? What are my processes? I handwrite. I don't have to go to a hotel. It'd be really strange, cramped prose if I wrote in a hotel. I like writing at home. And each book is a different part of the house that I write in. There was a book I wrote once, standing up in the kitchen. It smelt of baked bread. There was a story I wrote once, just walking up and down in my living room, with my just writing. And I believe that if an idea comes to you, start writing it as soon as possible. If it's urgent, don't wait. The most difficult thing is beginning. The most difficult thing is beginning. The second most difficult thing is finishing. Finishing is maybe the most important. But how are you going to finish if you don't begin? And when you finish, begin again. You know, I said to people, don't read, reread. The same thing I say to writers, don't write, rewrite.
You.
You said to ask what it means to be human is to ask in what ways our minds are imprisoned by the chains of society. Thank you for that thought. I think it may just have changed me as a person. But with that thought in mind, and you said, you also asked Chandrahas back in response to one of his questions, why can't a book be a human? So what does it mean to ask, what is a book?
It means to ask whether this thing that is supposedly between covers, whether it has life. And for me, that's what a real book is. It has life in it. It lives. It lives in you. It adds to your life. I mean, something can add to your life that doesn't have life itself. A book for me is a thing with living questions, not answers, questions. We need questions more than anything else. You know, we've got too many people out there who are giving us answers. They're usually the wrong answers, but they're very persuasive. But we need people to ask us questions that wake us up. Questions that make our heads spin round, our brains spin round, and turn back inwards and say, whoa, who am I? What is this? What is this? What is this journey? What is this thing they call reality? The greater the question, the more alive the book. There are many people you meet whose living presence don't ask you a question. For me, a living person that you meet is someone who forces you to ask questions about yourself that you've never asked before. my daughter does that. My daughter of 2 does that to me all the time. She's been asking me questions that philosophers as great as Rousseau and Plato haven't got around asking me.
Yes, you at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this absolutely enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Ben, in a world where the art and the freedom of expression is being constantly challenged, thank you for asking the question, who is the prisoner? I think it's ever more important and very, very inspiring. My question is, have you ever felt imprisoned by any notion or thought or experience? And if so, how have you built a ladder out of that prison of sorts, that internal prison, mind prison, if so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think we're born into a prison of thoughts. We are. We're born, and our parents, with the best will in the world, start to imprison us. They don't mean to. They say, "You see those people over there? Don't trust them. They come from so-and-so village. They come from so-and-so place." First imprisonment. They say, you know that person over there? They worship one God. Don't trust them. Second imprisonment. Or that person over there, they come from a people who worship many gods. Don't trust them. You know, they don't mean to. And then we go to school, and then the teachers, with the best will in the world, they imprison us. They don't mean to. I'll give you one of my imprisonments, mental imprisonments, and I've got many. You grew up with the notion that the man goes to work and the woman works at home. This is what you were taught growing up. That's a prison. That's one of the worst prisons in society. It's ridiculous. Why should the idea of work, the nobility of work, be confined to one gender or to one anything? There's a class imprisonment. The idea that you can't do this or you can't do that because you didn't go to this school or that school. The idea that that person is bright because they come from that family. They're all prisons. The world is full of prisons. The greatest journey of our lives is the slow progression through these prisons that we comfortably inhabit, and that limits our humanity and our possibility and our mutual richness together on this planet. It's a question that Plato started over 3,000 years ago. The idea that, the things that we see on the cave walls are real. That's what literature does at its best, to just slowly winkle our minds from these concentric circle of prisons that we inhabit. Thank you. Give her a chance to make a quick counter remark.
No, it's not a counter. Thank you so much. That really was an incredible answer. But the second part of the question, which you answered in part, was that you were at some point in life imprisoned by the idea that a man should work and a woman should, be restricted to household chores or whatever. How did you, and if you have, built a way out of that prison? I'm sorry, you can choose not to answer this, because I need to understand how do you build your way out of prisons. That was also part of the questions, besides literature.
Well, in that particular instance, it was just a very simple matter of looking at the world around me. And I couldn't see what distinction there was between my father and my mother that meant my father couldn't work and my mother couldn't. And anyway, my mother worked. She rebelled and worked. She got a job, she made things, she got herself a degree, She became a chef. So I could see immediately that actually, finally, it's a fundamental question of humanity. We either extend to one another the freedom that we have, or we don't. Having said that, I also want to say that we have choices, that there are men who have the perfect right to say, I want to do the housework, I want to be at home. You can go work, I want to be at home. So you can choose how you want to be, but you can only choose in freedom, not in imprisonment.
What about you there? Yes.
The lady at the front is really insistent, so let's not forget to give her a chance.
Yes.
It was that lady who. Oh, okay.
So
I'll let you handle it.
just a quick question. There are a lot of economic pressures on creative people, whether you're a singer, you're a composer, you're a writer. And having been in a bustling metro all my life, like Mumbai, I have huge bills to pay. I would love to slow read, but I don't feel I have the luxury of that. And I'm also losing the touch that I had with the magical skill of creating worlds with words. And whenever I listen to you, I'm recalling the self that I knew 20 years ago, which could negotiate creativity the way you do. So how have you sustained the essence of your creative self?
I think this is becoming a better and better conversation as we go along. We should have started after 1 hour instead of ending here.
I haven't really sustained it. I've just kept on asking my questions. When you say you're too busy to read slowly, that's the most paradoxical remark I've heard all day. I would have thought that it's precisely because you're busy that you should read slowly, because then it's about the quality of your reading. I mean, I'd rather you read one paragraph well than a whole book badly. Really. I mean, honestly, one sentence in a good book can change your life. One sentence. And as for sustaining your creativity, it comes down to the choice. It comes down to your fundamental hunger. My fundamental hunger was not about getting rich. My fundamental hunger was about going on asking the question that eats away at my soul. No, not eats. That, I'm going to borrow this phrase from Emily Dickinson, that nibbles at the soul. And I've always chosen paths and people, and my decisions have been guided by what will help me go on making the contribution I can go on making. And so I'd rather live in a smaller room and have the freedom to dream and write than to live in a bigger house and have to spend all my day making the money to pay for it, and therefore I'm losing the time in which to be most truthful to myself. It's a choice I'm making. Finally, it's a choice between what you care about the most and what the world wants you to care about the most. We're back to prisons again.
Well,
have we run out of time?
We have that clock there that has been on zero for quite a while now, actually. I know that so many of you still have questions to ask. I think this is one of the problems of always having a shall we? Yes.
The lady at the front.
Yes. I think people who come for the second time to JLF get a quick one. Yes.
Just a very quick one.
Thank you very much.
Make it a slow question.
When I look at your book cover, who is the prisoner? I wondered whether it was the freedom artist or whether it was Ben Okri. Can you please reply? Who is the prisoner? Is it you or the freedom artist?
These are 3 levels. There are 3 levels of reality here. At the lowest level is the writer, of course. In the middle level is the freedom artist. We don't know who the freedom artist is. We will try and discover that. And at the highest level, because it concerns all of us the most, is the question, who is the prisoner? This is the question I want you to take away with you. Not the freedom artist, not Ben Okri, but to ask, who is the prisoner? Who is the prisoner inside yourself? Who is the prisoner in society? Who is the prisoner in time? Who is the prisoner here amongst us now? Ben Okri might be a prisoner, but is working hard on his escape.
Okay. Ben, always a pleasure, and this was such a good conversation on so many levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jed. Thank you all. It's a pleasure. Blessing.
Thank you.